So you can hear me. We've got something on the screen. And I'll just wait for Ben to finish his job. Okay. Oh, we're in business. So, if you've been waiting patiently and looking at those two pictures and you're wondering, some of you may be able to identify the picture on the left, because it is somewhere in England, not in Jerusalem. It's the Roman baths in Bath, and in the city of Bath, which makes it confusing, a bath in Bath. But they were built in Roman times, not much later than the time that Jesus was on the earth. And the pool that we'll be reading about will not be massively different in what it would have looked like than that pool that you could go and visit if you went to the city of Bath. And on the right is just a model that's in a museum in Israel of what it may have looked like, the site. It would have been two pools, but you can see the colonnades around, just as in the Roman bath in Bath. So there we are. Gives you an opportunity just to see the picture. So we can have the next slide. There we go. So we'll have the reading that's on the screen, but just let's introduce where we are. We've been looking at incidents in John's Gospel where Jesus has met various individuals, and it's the record of the encounters that we've been looking at. And these incidents are only found in John's Gospel. And the people that met Jesus in those encounters had their lives changed forever. And today we're in chapter 5, and we're going to read the first 18 verses of the healing of a lame man, an invalid, at the pool at Bethesda. So I will read, and the reading should appear on the screen. Some time later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the Sheep Gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I am trying to get in, someone else gets down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" So they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to the very day, and I too am working." For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. May God bless his word to us. Now, I just need to check, are we recording okay? So we're good to record. So first of all, let me set the scene. There's another picture, a bigger picture of those Roman baths in the city of Bath. So by looking at that, maybe you're getting a picture of the scene. And Jesus is in Jerusalem, and he makes a point of visiting a bathing pool. And just like in our Bible story, you can see that the pool in Bath is surrounded by covered colonnades. And we're told in verse 3 of the story that lots of people with diseases and disabilities would congregate under the shade of these covered colonnades. I think the weather in Jerusalem, particularly in summer, was rather hotter than you may get in Bath. But it would be under the shade of these covered colonnades, protected from the hot sun, that these people may be there the whole day and day after day. And both the pools would have likely have been fed by warm underground springs, and they were thought to have healing properties, just like that pool in Bath, that it would have certain healing properties, the mineral content of the water. And from time to time, the waters stirred. We read that in verse 7, about the waters being stirred. And we don't really know what caused those waters to be stirred, but it may well have been that there was a periodic bubbling up of the waters in the pool from probably activity in the underground thermal springs that fed into the pool. And we'll see that the man thought that this was significant, and we'll come to that in due course. And Jesus walked among the crowd of people at the pool. And there was a man there that we read about who'd been there. He was an invalid, couldn't walk, and he'd been there for 38 years. And Jesus approached the man. So the scene is set. So if we go on to the next slide, please. And I want us to consider what we may learn about the three main characters in the story and the sequel that follows in the later verses. We've got three main sets of characters, haven't we? We've got the invalid, we've got the Jewish leaders who come into the story a little bit later after the healing, and we've got Jesus. And I'm hoping that we will see something of ourselves in these characters, both the good, particularly the invalid and the Jewish rulers, both the good and the not so good, as we look at their words and their actions. So first of all, what do we learn about the invalid? This invalid of 38 years, and he appears to have some issues relating to change. He appears to doubt whether a change in his circumstances is both possible or is it even desirable. So first, he doesn't seem to believe that change is possible. Jesus asks him one question, just one question. And it's recorded in the last part of verse 6. And you might think what a strange question to ask this man who's been an invalid for 38 years. And he asks him this question: do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? Now, you might think the answer is so obvious. Why would anybody ask a man who's been like this for 38 years? Why would you ask, do you want to get well? Isn't the answer obvious? Of course I do. Of course I want to be changed. To be able to walk freely after 38 years of being extremely disabled, it's obvious. But if you notice, this invalid's answer isn't a resounding yes to the straightforward question, do you want to get well? Instead, what this man does is explain his situation. And in verse 7, we read these words: "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred, when it bubbles up. And while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. So I can't get into this water at the right time, just the right time when it's bubbling. And, maybe I could get healed." So we discover that this invalid believes that a change in his circumstances just is not possible. If only he could get into the pool at just the right time when the water's stirred, maybe there would be the possibility for healing. But the invalid had nobody to help him get into the water at the perfect time. You see, it's if only, if only. And I was wondering, I say this to myself as much as I share it with you, are we sometimes like this? If only this happened. If only, I used to think sometimes, if only I could retire from work. Just think of what I could do. And actually, I remember for the first months, I'm a bit manic at all the things. Oh, I must make this, I must do that. I mustn't waste the time. And then 8 years later, however long it is since I've been retired, you just don't know where the time's gone. And perhaps it's just age. You don't get done all the things that you may have done years ago. But we can be, can't we? If only this, my life would be so different. If only, if only. And I wonder, do we sometimes think that change isn't possible in our own lives or in the lives of those we care about? So is change possible? But then I think there may be another thing going on. Is change desirable? So even if change is possible, does the invalid have some doubts whether change is a good thing? You may be familiar with the very old, how many people does it take to change a light bulb jokes? If you remember, there's lots of them. I remember hearing this, it must be 30 years ago, so there's nothing new about this joke. And here it is. How many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. Now, it might make you smile, but there's a grain of truth, isn't it? Does he really want to change? Why would Jesus say, do you want to be well? Do you want to get well? Is change desirable? Maybe he was fearful of what the future would bring if he was healed. You see, coming to that pool each day, his current life had routine. It was familiar. Maybe it was safe. Sitting on the mat had become a way of life. He possibly had a measure of security from the income he perhaps gained from begging. Perhaps he was within his comfort zone. Life wasn't brilliant, but if it changed dramatically, it would be so different. He possibly was fearful about change. And Isn't it the same for us sometimes? Making difficult changes in our own lives is never likely to be easy. The unknown can be scary. Scary for us, and maybe scary for those who we love and we care about. And particularly it can be scary for a group of believers together, for a church. When we look at the future and we think, if we did this, oh, that's scary. Oh, that's risky. Oh, I'm not sure. It's outside of our comfort zone. You know, it's hard to think of another time in our lifetimes when life has been as disrupted and turned upside down as it has this past 18 months. Our church life together has been challenging, to say the least. And, you know, perhaps like this invalid in our story, there may be some things that we might need to let go of. And maybe other things we need to grasp hold of, God-given opportunities that lie ahead. Perhaps being prepared to venture beyond our comfort zone, being people of hope in God's provision rather than being fearful. So that's the invalid. So let's look at other leading players in this story. We've got the Jewish leaders, and they come into the story once we get to verse 10 and through the rest of the story. What do we learn about them from this episode? And do we see anything of ourselves in them? We probably think, oh no, I'm not like them. What did they do? They turned Jesus' compassionate act of healing into a conflict about breaking Sabbath rules. A conflict about what could or couldn't be done on the Sabbath day. You see, carrying a mat on the Sabbath, that's breaking the Sabbath laws, or certainly the interpretation of the laws that the Jewish leaders had. You see, it counted as work, and there can be no work on the Sabbath because rules are rules. Carrying a mat is work. Now, if a person happened to be on a mat and you are moving them, that's different. But rules are rules. And healing an invalid on the Sabbath, which is what Jesus did, well, that's also breaking the Sabbath laws because that's counted as work. And there can be no work on the Sabbath because rules are rules. And this is how far the Jewish leaders were prepared to take it. And in verse 16 we read, because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. And in verse 18, it goes from bad to worse. For this reason, they tried all the more to kill Jesus. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but there was even more, and we'll touch on that in due course. So rules are rules. They were concerned about the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law, not the care, not the compassion that was being shown. Now, we're all different, aren't we, in this room and out there on Zoom? We have different personalities, different kinds of makeup. Now, here's a confession. I'm someone who likes organization. You probably know that. I like things being organized. I like things being planned. I like boundaries. I like rules. I like stationery. I like lines and graph paper. I'm strange. But you see, in many ways, I'd make a good Pharisee because I like rules. Rules are rules. Rules are not there to be broken. Rules are there to be followed. I like lists. I like shopping lists. I like crossing things off lists. Do you see? But there is a problem. You see, when you like everything to be nice and neat and tidy, we realize in life It often isn't like that, is it? And it's certainly not like that in church life. It's not nice and tidy. And you know, like those Jewish leaders, we too can sometimes be legalistic towards others, but also to ourselves. We get ourselves in all kinds of feelings of false guilt about what we did do, what we didn't do. We can be harder on ourselves than God is sometimes. We broke the rules that we perhaps God didn't set for us, we set for ourselves. It can be tough. You know, sometimes we may be overcritical and over-judgmental rather than being compassionate and gracious. How easy it is to fall into legalism and hypocritical thinking, forgetting God's graciousness towards us. So we too can be like those Jewish leaders. So let's move on to the next slide. And here is the final person in our story, the lead person, Jesus. Let's turn our attention to Jesus. What do we learn about Jesus from this episode? Well, there's certainly three things that we learn. We see Jesus' concern, we see his compassion, and we see his divinity. I said to Mary this morning, Gidnam can be, again, obsessed with things, obsessed with alliteration. I could have said concern, compassion, and co-equal with God, because that's the accusation at the very end that gets Jesus killed. He claims to be co-equal with God, as well as healing on the Sabbath. So let's look at Jesus' concern. In verse 6, we read, Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he'd been in this condition for a long time. Verse 6. Jesus knows you perfectly. He knew this man perfectly. Perhaps he knew about him, his concern about change in the future. Perhaps that's why I asked him that question. Do you want to get well? So it's a strange question to ask otherwise if you don't really know what is going on in a person. Jesus knows you perfectly. He knows everything about you and me. He knows us inside out. He knows everything you've ever felt, everything you've ever thought. In the words of the psalmist, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. Psalm 139. You see, Jesus knows and he cares. We see in verse 14 that Jesus' concern all along isn't just this individual's physical sickness. He heals the man of this physical condition. You might say, what a miracle. But you know, this isn't the greatest thing that Jesus has to say to this man. Jesus is concerned about this man's spiritual well-being, as much, if not more, than his physical condition. And we read in verse 14, later Jesus found him at the temple after he'd been healed, and he said to him, see, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse than being 38 years paralyzed will happen to you. Something worse. Stop sinning. You see, Jesus had no intention of leaving him with nothing more than a healed body. Jesus was most concerned with this man's spiritual well-being, the healing of his soul. Jesus wants this man to turn away from a life of sin and turn towards Jesus, turn towards him as the one who can give him true life. And you know, 2,000 years on from this episode, Jesus' concern is still for the spiritual well-being of people, including you and me. Jesus knows us. He is concerned about our well-being, our physical well-being, yes, but our spiritual well-being most of all. And 2,000 years on, Jesus can still transform lives, our lives and the ones who we care about. He can change us into faithful disciples who follow him. So Jesus is concerned for the man's physical well-being, but most of all, his spiritual well-being. But second, if we move on to the next slide, we see Jesus' compassion and kindness. Jesus chooses to go to the pool. And Jesus' compassion isn't just words, it's action. Get up, he says to the man. Pick up your mat and walk, verse 8. And you see, this healing is not a response to anything good about this man. In fact, this man does not come out well from this story. Think about it. He shows no faith at all. Doesn't even say, please make me well, as we've already seen. He displays no sign of faith, no sign of gratitude following his healing, unlike others that we read about in the Gospels who are healed. In fact, when he's confronted by the Jewish leaders, you might argue he dobs Jesus in. Oh, nothing to do with me carrying my mat. He told me to. No, whoa. You know, there is nothing to commend this man. Is there? No righteousness, no faith, no gratitude. The healing comes from Jesus' compassion. At least 9 times in the Gospels, we say that it says that Jesus was moved with compassion. That promotes Jesus' action. So not only does Jesus know you perfectly and me perfectly, but he's moved by the troubles we may be struggling with. Jesus has compassion towards us, and it knows no limits. Jesus' compassion. And finally, if we move on to the last slide. In the story, we see perhaps one of the most important points of all, because it all flows from Jesus' divinity, this incident. And John, who writes this incident for us to read all these years later, is keen to point this out. Jesus is divine. He is God with us. We read in verse 18, that final verse, they tried all the more to kill Jesus. Not only was he breaking the rules, the Sabbath rules, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. You can't do that. Make yourself equal with God. And as Brian reminded us in the very first talk in this series, that Jesus, yes, is a great miracle worker and healer. We see it in this story. But we must never forget the most amazing truth of all, that Jesus is God himself in human form, come to reveal the Father's love. In chapter 20 of John, and Brian reminded us of this, John makes it very clear what his gospel is all about. And he writes this: these healings that I've written about in these earlier chapters, including the one today, are recorded that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the thing that caused them to want to kill Jesus. And that by believing, you may have life. not just physical well-being, but spiritual well-being in his name. That is why this story is recorded, the main reason. So the last slide that just brings those thoughts about Jesus. Jesus' concern, Jesus' compassion, Jesus' divinity. And my prayer for myself and my prayer for you is that the Lord would open our eyes to know deep down that Jesus is the one who knows you and me. Jesus is the one who shows compassion towards you and me. And Jesus is the one who is divinely sovereign over us. He is the one who has come with saving and healing power for the sake of our everlasting health. Amen. May God bless you. So over to you, Rachel.